Welcome to Midlife Murmurings. Today's guest is Emma Thomas, and with our host Christopher Gates, she discusses a topic that directly affects 50% of us in midlife and indirectly affects everyone else, the menopause. Emma gives a really helpful introduction to what the perimenopause is and the menopause, as well as how individuals, their partners and their employers can better navigate this major transition in a woman's life, and how this can actually be a gateway to new life for many women as they find their midlife power. Do check out our links in the bio and join our Midlife Murmurings LinkedIn group. We'd love to see you there and to hear your own murmurings on midlife. For now though, enjoy the show. Emma Thomas, please introduce yourself.
Hi, Chris. I'm Emma Thomas. You can find me in various different places. What do I do? I'm the founder of Managing the Menopause, and we predominantly work with organisations, so helping raise awareness, helping educate, helping train line managers, that kind of thing. I'm also an executive coach under the moniker of the Triple Shift. I have a podcast of my own called Middling Along, which has been going for almost 5 years, which is slightly terrifying. And I am actually just about to launch a community for women in midlife called Holding Up the Sky with a fellow coach. We're going live in September of 2025, but that's the most recent thing that I'm working on.
You're obviously someone who has spoken to a number of people navigating midlife, or working with those who are navigating midlife. So good question for you is, what does midlife mean for you, Emma?
Gosh, apparently so many of us now are going to be living to 100. So, if we take that timeline, 50 is kind of bang right in the middle of that, isn't it? If we're lucky enough to make it to 100 years or more. And I think for so many of us, we get to that point and there's a lot of questioning and I guess recalibrating, really sort of thinking about what is it that I want to do with the rest of my life? If I'm lucky enough to have another 50 years on this planet, is it what I've already been doing? Some of us, if we're lucky enough to have children, we might be kind of out the other side of those kind of foggy early parenting days. Maybe we've got teenagers. Maybe they're already kind of bird launching off to university. So, there's that sort of that a bit more sort of time and space to step back and be a bit more thoughtful. But actually, I find also that perimenopause and menopause is a time where women in particular, the impact of symptoms for a lot of people actually kind of gives us no choice but to slow down a bit, take the foot off the accelerator a bit and go, okay, I can't keep going at the same kind of full throttle that I have been doing for the last however long. I've got to step back a bit and, really reprioritize myself. So we do talk about it as a bit of a window of opportunity for people to make some positive changes in their life and their lifestyles.
Very interesting. Now, you've used two terms there, perimenopause and menopause. Let's start with the basics. What do they mean and what's the difference between them?
Back to basics. Yeah.
Back to basics.
So a lot of the time when people or you read something in the media and they're talking about menopause, what they're really writing or talking about is perimenopause. So perimenopause means all of the time in the lead up to menopause whilst somebody is, they're perimenopausal, they're probably experiencing some kind of symptoms associated with that menopause transition. So if we were being really, really pedantic, menopause is just one day. And that one day, it's a little bit complex, but it's like a retroactive diagnosis. So it's when somebody has gone for 12 months with no menstrual period. So you would have several months with nothing happening. And then if you reach a whole 12 months of no period, then that's your day of menopause and then you're postmenopausal. Now, for some people, they might have a kind of a 3, 4, 5 months or whatever, and then they'll get an extra period and you kind of have to start the clock again. It's very frustrating, I believe. But yeah, so you've got that whole 12 months, nothing doing, and then you tip overnight, if you like, from perimenopausal to postmenopausal. So it's a little bit complicated. And I guess as shorthand, most people will talk about menopause or being menopausal. And it's not technically, they're not wrong, but if we're being pedantic, we're probably talking about perimenopause and then postmenopause.
And what's happening for the woman during that perimenopausal phase?
if we're premenopausal, so in our, if you like, our reproductive years, our estrogen and our progesterone are kind of cycling on that monthly cycle. So it's not like there's a sort of a set amount of those two hormones all through the months. They're constantly changing. When we get to perimenopause, things can start to go a bit haywire. So won't go into too much of the technicalities, but essentially, your estrogen levels sort of premenopausally fluctuate, but are kind of relatively within a stable window. When you get to perimenopause, think about it as suddenly being on a roller coaster. So you've got real lows and real highs. And it's that sort of fluctuation, if you like, that causes some of the symptoms. And then over time, those estrogen levels are going down and down. So you've got periods of fluctuation, but also a kind of a gradual tapering off towards the point of postmenopause. And that low estrogen will cause other symptoms. At the same time, you've got a big drop away in progesterone. That causes other symptoms. And actually, in early perimenopause, it's quite often that sort of lack of progesterone or the sort of very low progesterone, high estrogen that will kind of produce some of the most sort of problematic symptoms for people. So it's kind of understanding that sort of fluctuation and that change away from our kind of normal, if you like, and the fact that can take sort of several years to then get to a point where we've got the sort of the permanently lower levels of both of those, and our body essentially has to adapt. So we've kind of, you think of the other end at puberty, our body goes from not very much of either of those things to suddenly kind of adapting, and you think all of that turmoil and fluctuation of kind of going through teenagerdom. We're reasonably sympathetic to teenagers when they go through that hormone maelstrom. So I think at the other end of the spectrum, we should be extending that same understanding and sort of empathy to women who are kind of getting used to the sort of the opposite slant down at the other end of kind of that reproductive period.
So is it reasonable to consider it as a equivalent to puberty in terms of the emotional and hormonal shifts that are happening, and can come out of surprise if you've been used to not having those?
Yeah, lots of people call it sort of puberty in reverse. And, in the same way that individuals react entirely differently to their own sort of puberty experience or to their own pregnancy experience, and everyone's experience of perimenopause and menopause is going to be unique to them as well. So we've obviously got a sort of a set constellation of symptoms that we know about. Hopefully for most people, they're not going to get the whole kind of shopping list of, go through and tick every single one of those, and the symptoms can come and go over time. So when you think that sort of transition period can last probably on average sort of 4 to 7 years, it's not that you're necessarily going to have a symptom and keep it in a linear way over all of that time. You might have things that kind of come and go at different parts of the cycle while you're still kind of experiencing periods. There might be, periods of life when you're under additional stress, and that might exacerbate symptoms, or it's so highly individualized, and some people seemingly sail through this pretty much, unscathed, happily wave goodbye to their periods and kind of skip off into a wonderful post-menopause sunset. And then some people actually, maybe around a quarter of people experience really quite debilitating or life impacting symptoms and need, proper help and support with that. So the conversation has moved on a huge amount in the 5 years that I've been sort of actively working in this space. But still, I'm kind of surprised by how little women, have an in-depth understanding of what's going on. And, unsurprisingly, because we don't get taught this stuff necessarily, at school or in the same way that we might say go to an NCT class if we're pregnant. We don't kind of go along and join what to expect when you're not expecting anymore menopause class.
And so if many women don't understand for themselves what's happening, their poor fellas often have no chance, right?
Yeah, I mean, there are a few books actually that have come out recently that are specifically aimed aimed at men or partners of people that are going through perimenopause. And I know there was recent one that was written by a couple, so that you kind of got both perspectives on what's happening in a relationship as you sort of navigate through that. If it's you going through menopause, it can be quite hard to articulate to yourself what is it that you're experiencing and how are you feeling. So, to try and then explain that to somebody else, and for that person to then be able to
Yeah.
kind of empathize with that experience can be really difficult.
And so it'd be interesting to understand some of the ways that your clients see that period of life affecting their relationships that are close to them. What are some of the sort of things that you've seen with others you're working with?
So one of the real big things that can impact on people is around kind of confidence, actually. So I think we have perhaps greater understanding of this physical side of perimenopause and menopause, but less so in terms of the sort of psychological, emotional side. So, very often people's confidence is impacted. So confidence and resilience, if you like. And I think those are kind of two sides of the same thing. And then, the sort of the brain fog, fatigue and energy side of things that, can really impact, especially if you've always been the person that's kind of been juggling all the things, keeping the wheels on the bus, making sure that everyone's looked after, everyone's got what they need and they're in the right place at the right time. And then suddenly there's a bit of a feeling, and there's actually an acronym for this called NFLM, not feeling like myself. And there have been scientific papers written about this. And it is that kind of nebulousness of, oh gosh, I used to be able to do this with one hand tied behind my back, right? I was all over this stuff. And now suddenly what's wrong with me? I'm feeling more stressed. I'm feeling less resilient. I'm feeling much less confident in my ability. I'm forgetting things. Lots of people, sadly thinking that they might be experiencing something like early onset dementia because the brain fog is just so intense sometimes. And anxiety is another really big one. And that's quite often one of the sort of the early warning lights, if you like, for early perimenopause. People who've really never struggled with anxiety before might find that they're suddenly very anxious in different ways. So that might be through sort of anxiety around driving, it might be social anxiety, or it might be just a sort of a more generalized sense of kind of anxiety and sort of waking up at 3 a.m. with this sense of doom and just feeling like you're not quite sure why you're feeling so anxious, but you know that you feel different. And certainly for people who might have struggled with anxiety and depression in the past, and this can be a real trigger for that to kind of come back or to kind of kick up a gear. And obviously that can impact a lot on relationships. So that confidence can impact on things like, libido and sort of the sexual part of relationships. The sort of anxiety, social anxiety might mean that people, they don't want to go out as much or at all, or they might just not have the energy to be going and doing things. And actually, if you're on I guess the sort of the outside looking in, and that person that you're with seems to you to have changed quite a lot, that can be really distressing. Or people might feel, is it me? Have I done something wrong? And actually, if you can't articulate easily what it is that is you feel is happening to you, it's quite difficult then for the other person in that relationship to be supportive and to kind of help you navigate through that. So yes, I think it's really, really important to kind of blast through some of the stigma and taboo about this and demystify some of it so that we can have these kind of conversations, and people can say to their sort of significant other, look, I don't know what is going on. I don't know how long it's going to keep happening. I can't tell you that, by next January, it's all going to be good. But that kind of open communication and being able to be honest and open and really vulnerable. I think lots of people do feel really lonely and vulnerable at this time. And I'm so glad that we're talking about it more openly, that people don't have to sort of have that shame and that stigma of, other generations who are just like, suck it up, get on with it, right?
Yeah.
Suffer in silence, probably, oh, I'm not going to bother the doctor. I'm not, I'm just going to soldier on with my, 10 hot flushes a night and no sleep and be a martyr and just keep pushing through.
Sounds like a really disorienting and bewildering time if these things are happening without necessarily the understanding or the support around to help you through
Well,
those.
and particularly Actually, if people haven't sort of joined the dots already and realised that what they're experiencing is perimenopause related. So very often, it might be quite some time before the kind of, that light bulb moment goes. And whether it's listening to a podcast or whether it's finally sitting down with a GP who kind of knows their stuff and recognizes what's happening. If you only have 10 minutes in a GP appointment, and you're going in with something, I don't know, specific about like heart palpitations, for example, one of the things that I experienced, and actually this happened in the pandemic, was I was having heart palpitations. I actually ended up going in and being wired up to an ECG, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with me. And since I've started taking hormone therapy, I don't have palpitations anymore. But for somebody that is happening to in isolation of understanding what it might be, that can be really distressing. Or, something like the anxiety or the brain fog. So it's almost like joining the dots is that first part of understanding, and then potentially getting help and support from the right places if that's something that people need.
I know you coach women through the perimenopause and postmenopause.
Mhm.
How do you work with them in those two kind of distinct phases of that transition?
It's obviously highly individualized, and as a coach, I don't just work with people going through menopause, but it's one group of people that I do work with. And it will very much depend on what are they experiencing, what's the sort of, almost kind of look at this 360-degree situation as well. What's going on at work? What's going on at home? What's going on in terms of the sort of the physical and psychological impact of what they're going through? What's their attitude to things like hormone therapy? Because obviously not everybody wants to go down that route, and there are other options out there. And for some people, it's just not an option for various reasons. And so really trying to sort of help people self advocate so that they can feel confident if they need to, having conversations at work or in the healthcare settings, but also helping people to look at, really look at their strengths and focus on those, particularly if confidence is impacted. So really working on that side of thing with the coaching, building back up that confidence and resilience, and having that understanding that it is a transition, it is a sort of a temporary state. And I think that can be tricky sometimes to kind of hold on to, but like there is that sort of light at the end of the tunnel, and lots of people kind of coming out at the other end into that sort of post-menopausal state, talking about feeling much calmer, clearer, more confident, really kind of coming into their own, and feeling, quite powerful. And that's not necessarily something that we hear enough about. So it was a really interesting, so book recommendation for people is Dr. Lisa Mosconi's book, The Menopause Brain. And so she's one of the leading researchers in this particular field, works a lot in sort of Alzheimer's disease as well. So she talks about these 3 Ps in a woman's life. So puberty, pregnancy, and perimenopause, and that each of these stages, our brains are going through this sort of pruning process. We're shedding some of those kind of connections and networks that we no longer need, that don't serve us anymore. And so for most people, they're kind of coming out of that. If they've been through this sort of brain foggy state, actually coming out of that at the other end with a real sort of uptick in terms of performance. And that, very interestingly, she's talked about the fact that even though not for all women, but for some women, that kind of performance around sort of brain function can be impacted because we have estrogen and progesterone receptors all over our brains as well as our bodies. That actually, the sort of, if you look at the baseline average, even the women's kind of slightly lower performance is still higher than men's if you compare male brain, female brain. So we might feel that we're kind of impacted, but actually, we're still, if we're on an average, we're still actually performing on a higher level than the sort of the average of a male brain. So they're
How
interesting for
interesting.
you.
Very interesting. I always knew my wife was much smarter than me. all the time, even more so in this chapter. Thinking about that power. Yeah, they come into this time of power. And I think it's really interesting that this theme of shedding things that no longer fit is coming out in each of the midlife conversations, whether you're male or female, whether
Yeah.
you're in it or post or through it. It's interesting that that fundamental hormonal change is happening at a time when there's also lots of other things happening in a midlifer's life that cause them to ask questions, deep, deep questions. How have you seen some of your clients use that power in midlife to make significant choices and decisions and really empower the next stage of their lives as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think it it's really doing the work to figure out what's not serving us anymore. Let's be honest, for some people that might be around relationships that they have, spent a good amount of their time, investing in, and then it's a peak time for divorce, obviously, kind of around midlife menopause, that drop in estrogen, a sort of biddable, nurturing hormone. We might actually find that the relationships that we have been in no longer work for us, and that we have the sort of we find the inner strength to walk away from them. If my husband's listening, don't worry, I'm not, I'm not about to walk away from you. But for many people, it's that sort of transformative piece of, and it's a kind of a combination of, I suppose, that midlife point, that inflection point, and maybe the kind of the hormone change that is the undertow to that is kind of has an impact. Lots of us choosing to make kind of career pivots, realizing that, yeah, we're not, again, it's that sort of biddable hormone, right? We're not willing to put up with less than ideal circumstances that maybe we've been putting up with in the workplace for so long. And looking for alternatives, whether that's, going and retraining, starting our own businesses, moving somewhere else that, we realize that we're not going to put up with those circumstances that we have been for a while. So I think it's in when you're talking about kind of harnessing that power, those are the kinds of things. It's like finding that you do have this kind of inner strength. And certainly, other people that I've
Yeah.
interviewed on the podcast, I was a couple of weeks ago released one from Dr. Rachel Crystal, who had done her MSc, interviewing sort of 15 women about their experiences of perimenopause and burnout. Again, lots of them saying that they'd come out of the other side with this increased confidence, feeling so much more resilient. So it's almost like you've got to go through that quagmire of the bad bit to get the benefits coming out the other side. Like, well, I've survived that. I can do anything now. What have you got, life? Throw it at me.
And hopefully then setting you up for the next chapter of life as well
Absolutely.
on a sound foundation. That's really exciting. And what drew you to this work, Emma? Because it's deep work, isn't it?
There's a deep question. I started my podcast fairly accidentally, actually, in lockdown. Um, and I didn't really know what I was doing. And I think that I was looking for a bit of a creative outlet at a very kind of turbulent time. At the same time that I started that, I was actually leading our employee resource group for women and gender at the company that I used to work at. I feel like those two things kind of dovetailed quite neatly. I'd already had for some years a real interest in the sort of DE&I space. And so I guess over the course of a couple of years, I was leading that employee resource group that really blossomed. I had an opportunity to start a coaching qualification paid for by my employer. So I did that. I just really enjoy seeing people make those transformations. It's a real privilege to be part of that.
And how did you pick up the work around the menopause? Was that just a natural outworking of the wider work, or was that a conscious decision on your side?
I was actually made redundant from my corporate role just over 3 years ago, and I could see through my work on the podcast, how many people still didn't really understand what was happening to them at this stage of life. I could see what an impact it was having in terms of, sort of 1 in 10 women leaving the workplace because they weren't getting the right kind of support. I could see that there were other companies doing similar things. And actually, my sister in law, Beth, is a GP and a menopause specialist. So there was that sort of natural dovetailing. So we worked together some of the time on sort of ask us anything sessions for companies. So I was, really bringing, I guess, my corporate understanding, all of the learning that I had accumulated through running the podcast for sort of 3-4 years by that point, working with Beth, having that deep scientific and medical underpinning. And yeah, I guess the sort of the coaching element as well all came together into what managing the menopause is now, and it's continuing to kind of evolve and change, and I'm running my coaching practice alongside, and sometimes those sort of two things inform one another or kind of overlap slightly.
And given the work you've done both in your corporate chapter and subsequently thinking about the organizations that you work with, are there any particular practices or policies or postures that are helpful for them in supporting individuals going through that menopausal stage of life?
A lot of it is around culture and communication. And so, the organizations that are doing this really well are not just kind of doing a kind of a tick boxy, here's our menopause policy, here's a talk that we did for World Menopause Day, that's us done for another year. It really is 365 days a year that they are continuing to work to normalize the conversation. They're continuing to build organizational cultures where there is the psychological safety for people to talk about difficult things, removing that stigma, because it's very much still felt by a lot of people. I think there's a vulnerability in sort of being open and saying, I am struggling with whatever it is you're struggling with. They're training their line managers to have that understanding and that empathy, and to have those sometimes difficult conversations, but to feel kind of comfortable. That's a huge part of it,
Yeah.
is not shying away from having those conversations. And things like flexible working are incredibly important. I know we're seeing a lot of companies with sort of quite rigid return to office mandates, but really kind of having flexibility is such an important thing when you're kind of going through this transition. For people who, maybe they're having terrible bouts of insomnia or kind of night sweats, and and it's unpredictable, and it's not that you can say,
Yeah.
oh, I need to come in late on Tuesday because I'm going to have a terrible night's sleep on Monday, right? You need the flexibility to be able to be honest and open with your team and say, I've had 2 hours sleep. I'm not safe to drive into the office today. Is it okay if I work from home this morning, or I have a slightly later start?
And tiredness is such a real thing, isn't it? Tiredness affects
Yeah,
everything.
yeah, it is. And, even sort of next day, things in terms of, that the brain fog impacted by tiredness, the things around sort of um, hunger and cravings impacted by how much sleep we've had, how much of a propensity we have to go and do the kind of the healthy exercise that we know is going to benefit is impacted by how much sleep we've had. How irritable or otherwise we are with our partners or our families or our team members is impacted by how much sleep we have. So it really is such a huge one.
Financial imperative is clear as well for these businesses. If 1 in 10 women are leaving the workplace through the menopause period, that's a huge amount of knowledge, capability, just as people are coming into their prime in terms of potential to contribute.
Yeah.
The experience that's lost is colossal.
And those senior, we need more senior women going into positions of leadership. There's a huge impact on sort of, the gender balance within organizations, gender pay gap, the gender pension gap. And it's not just necessarily people leaving. It's, these are women who are not going for promotions within the company because of that sort of confidence, that lack of confidence and resilience, or maybe they've just stepped up into a role, but they suddenly then they've got that huge imposter feelings, and they're really struggling with that kind of step up. And those are the kind of situations where coaching can be really transformative and sort of giving people that scaffolding and the support right at the time when they really need it. And younger women coming into the organization, they're watching, they're looking for how that organization is supporting people who are kind of 10, 15 years ahead of them. And they are expecting that help and support to be there increasingly. We've got millennials are now going into menopause, right? We've got this wonderful menopause term, which I've kind of come across over the last 12 months or so. But yeah, and people's expectations of what organizations need to be supporting them with are kind of changing so much, and that people see when organizations really mean it, and it's not just some words on a policy in a filing cabinet somewhere that are kind of meaningless.
It's interesting, isn't it? You called out the three P's of puberty and pregnancy and perimenopause, and so much sort of corporate focus has been on supporting people through the second of those P's to make sure that they can still be supported by that company and that environment, and that their careers can continue to be invested and nurtured during that pregnancy phase. But so little we see around the third of those P's, which sounds as equally significant in a
Mm.
woman's development and well-being.
And actually, because we're potentially having children later in life, those two things can actually run into one another. So you've got the sort of postpartum period can overlap with perimenopause, and then you've got a real kind of grey area of, is that tiredness just because I've got a toddler and a 5-year-old, or is it that I'm now really kind of butting up against perimenopause? Is it the sort of the stress of juggling all of those things, that kind of midlife collision of young children, elderly parents? How do I tease apart what's just common or garden stress and what's perimenopause symptom related? And so, yeah, those two things can collide more often than you might think.
And for an organisation, is there any legislation around what companies should be doing by law in this area?
So, menopause action plans are coming. They will be required from 2027, but they'll be voluntary from next year, from 2026, for companies that have more than 250 employees. So, already some companies are kind of getting ahead of the curve on this, and they're starting to create menopause action plans, sort of as a part of the sort of the bigger work that they're doing, perhaps around gender pay gap, for example. I think that those two things are linked together in the legislation. Um, and it's also really important that companies understand in terms of discrimination legislation as well. So actually the number of employment tribunals that are in some way linked to menopause, so citing menopause, whether that's disability discrimination, sex discrimination, those have been increasing year on year reasonably substantially. And I think part of that is around the sort of the increased awareness of how it's impacting on people in workplaces. And there have been some quite high profile cases in the news as well. So I think, as people see those, there's sort of greater awareness, and people are more likely to move to a tribunal where their treatment by a company has been less than ideal. So, I think that's something that's really important for employers to be aware of as well.
For leaders who are listening to this and maybe heard of menopause action plans for the first time, where can they find out more information about them?
So you'll hopefully share our website, so they can go there and find out some more information. They can get in contact with me and have a free half an hour discussion so that we can talk about how we might be able to help them put menopause action plans together. It very much depends on where an organization might be in terms of their journey. Some people are sort of starting really from nothing. Some people already have some really good stuff in place already. And so it's just a question of building on that. So we'll definitely take a tailored approach to supporting people.
Is there one thing that you wish everyone could know about menopause?
I wish everybody knew that the symptoms are probably going to kick in earlier than you think.
What sort of age are you seeing symptoms kicking in?
So Well, so the average age for people to reach menopause itself here in the UK, sort of developed Western world, is 51. So you kind of work back from that and think at the upper end of the sort of spectrum, people could be experiencing symptoms for 10 years. But then 1 in 20 people actually are going through early menopause between 40 and 45. So again, you kind of work back and you think mid to late 30s, you could be experiencing symptoms. And then around 2 in every 100 actually go through menopause under 40. So it's premature ovarian insufficiency. So, I think a lot of people have that sort of ingrained idea of what somebody experiencing menopause might look like. And they probably in their mind wouldn't associate themselves with that sort of image. And so I think for a lot of people there is that they are not necessarily blindsided, but surprised to find, you know, that symptoms are kind of kicking in earlier than they might expect them to.
And if someone's listening to this and suddenly gone, that could be me, it's the first step, a visit to the GP.
Yeah, and actually we've got a great PDF download on the website, which I will provide you a link for, and people can download that. It's a GP guide developed in conversation with Dr. Beth Thomas. So it gives you sort of pointers for how to approach your GP appointment. It's got a symptom checklist at the back. So if you're old school like me, you can print that out and kind of scribble all over it. Take it along with you to your GP appointment. That can be really helpful. Just some pointers around how best to prepare. If you're really, really struggling, think about taking somebody in with you, whether that's kind of a friend or a relative or something, someone that can kind of help you advocate, sort of help prompt you if you're feeling particularly brain foggy and you kind of, you need to focus on looking at your things, and someone else can focus on listening to the GP and kind of making some notes for you. So really taking a little bit of time to prepare, thinking about mapping out some of the symptoms for a month or two before you go, or at least kind of pulling all of that evidence base together before you go into that 10-minute appointment and really making the most of it.
That sounds incredibly practical and helpful. Thank you. We certainly will include the link to that PDF. Now, Emma, bringing it back a bit closer to home, if you could whisper one truth to yourself as you had entered midlife, what would it be?
I would tell myself, you're about to embark on the most creative chapter of your life yet.
Good.
And I
Very
would be
good.
very happy to hear that.
Yeah. How exciting. Well, thank you so much for your time and your experience and your wisdom. That's been great. I'll certainly make sure we include all the links in the show notes. Is there anything you'd like to say in closing, Emma?
Just that I do have a Substack, which I share interesting articles, tips, tricks, things that I have found to be sort of supportive. I share about the podcast in there, just to help people keep up to date, because I know it's quite tricky to keep on top of these things. It's middling along the messy middle on Substack, and I'd love to see some of your listeners pop up in my subscriber list.
Great. Thank you so much. Excellent.
Thank you, Chris. Bye.